Hello, welcome to the Hour of History podcast. I'm Stephen Bauman, and it's great to be with my audience for another week. We've got some exciting stuff today. You might know history as a class where you just had to memorize names and dates, famous people. But here on the podcast, we bring history to life through conversation with some of the world's greatest experts who study different times and places all over the world. Many podcasts today and shows are tailored to a tiny, narrow audience of people who are interested in only one topic, but at the Hour of History, we talk about the whole world, our world. We talk about topics from the beginning of humanity, covering all time. We talk about events all over the globe, any place. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. And if you're interested in hearing fantastic history from experts all around the world, listen to the over 100 episodes that we have at hourofhistory.com, where you will learn about revolutions, empires, cultures, arts, languages, environments, war, and so much more. I spoke last month to James Carter about his new book, Champions Day, and the outbreak of World War II in the international settlement in Shanghai. Today, we cross to the other side of the globe. We're staying in the same time period, but we're uncovering an often misrepresented and misunderstood conflict that similarly took place at the beginning of World War II. Today, I'm delighted to welcome a historian who has written several excellent books about World War II. His newest book, Poland 1939, The Outbreak of World War II, will be released by Basic Books this July. It's a perfect book. I know I'm doing a lot more reading right now, perfect book to read at home. It features a close examination of the beginning of World War II in Europe and highlights some new, exciting Polish sources and voices we haven't heard before. Through his work, Roger Moorhouse will help us to untangle some of the myths and misconceptions that have long rendered Poles as voiceless and beaten actors in this massive conflict, World War II. Just now, we're going to talk fascism, communism, and Polish resistance in 1939. Roger, welcome to the Hour of History.
Hello, Steve. Thanks for having me.
It's so good to have you, and it's interesting to read a book about this moment in history that's so often, it's a page or a paragraph, but never the focus of a book. So maybe if you could introduce yourself and tell our listeners who you are and how we got to this moment.
Well, I'm a historian primarily of sort of German history, so I've done a few books that cover German history, and when I was way back at 25 years ago plus now, when I was back at university, I started off studying Central European history. That was my sort of passion at the time. I went to university soon after the revolutions of 1989, and that sort of inspired me, and that's what I wanted to study. Now, how did we get here? So I've kind of come full circle. So from that, my early studies being very much Central European based, and then when I started writing, I found a niche doing German history, mainly because I speak German, and I lived in Germany for a while. So that was a sort of a ready in. And then I've sort of the last two books have sort of taken me further eastward again. The previous big book I did was called The Devil's Alliance, which was about the Nazi-Soviet Pact of 1939, and then this one, Poland 1939, is I suppose in many ways a follow-on from that. The Nazi-Soviet Pact obviously is the arrangement, the treaty between Moscow and Berlin that sort of paves the way for World War II. Effectively, paves the way certainly for the joint attack on Poland in 1939. And this sort of follows on from that. So it examines the German attack on Poland, 1st of September 1939, and then the Soviet attack, which follows on the 17th of September 1939. So, and these are subjects that actually are really underknown. I think even I kind of I hesitate to sort of include the American mindset in with the British one, because I know you have a particular view of World War II. You know, you have your own experiences of World War II as well. And the events of Central and Eastern Europe in September 1939 must feel a long way away for Americans. It's not something you're directly involved in. And I know a large proportion of American opinion probably still thinks that the war starts at Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941. that's when your war starts, right? So that's fine. But the war in Europe starts on the 1st of September, 39, and that's one that we as Brits, we struggle, I think, to really get a handle on the events of that autumn. And as you say, it's usually passed over. The Polish campaign is usually passed over in a paragraph or a couple of pages at best, and really doesn't get the scrutiny that I think it deserves. So that's the reason why I wanted to do that, to give it that scrutiny and to sort of uncover new sources and new voices and to tell the story properly.
And that's great. And hopefully we get a chance to get a little bit into your background. You talked about the importance of language and your love of history that's been for a long period of time. But first, I'd like to dive right in since you've kind of set it up for us. We have this question of, well, when does the war begin? And last month I was talking to Jay Carter about in Shanghai, how, Japanese invasions, for them, it's much earlier, but you have Poland, 1939. I mean, September 1st. This is kind of an undisputed conflict beginning. What is the impetus for this? Does your book start exactly on the 1st of September, or is it necessary as historians to kind of work our way in?
It sort of does. It starts actually with the night before, 31st of August 39, which is the what's known as the Gleiwitz incident. Which was a sort of staged, it's actually a false flag operation. False flag operation is quite a sort of common term these days. It's a false flag operation carried out by the Germans, particularly by the SS, not far from the Polish border, effectively to feign a Polish attack on German soil. And this was to give the Germans then their excuse to attack Poland the following morning, effectively. So what they wanted to do, they knew that the Poles had these alliances with the British and the French, and they wanted to effectively, try and nullify that, to sort of separate Poland out from its international alliances by basically casting Poland as the bad guy. So that's what the Gleiwitz incident was meant to do. So I start with that sort of dramatic account of the Gleiwitz incident, which is fascinating, actually. It's a really interesting account. It's something that is routinely, where it's mentioned at all, it's kind of routinely misunderstood and sort of misrepresented. So again, like all of this, unfortunately, history is a curious thing, because in many cases, the way it's sort of passed down through various historians and various accounts, it very often gets altered and shifted, like a sort of process of Chinese whispers. And sort of little aspects creep into the narrative which are untrue or inaccurate, and they become sort of gospel truth and get repeated over and over again. And unless you go back to the original documents, you never actually sort of clear up those confusions. And this is a good example of that. The way that Gleiwitz incidents are usually discussed is almost always wrong. So it was quite fun to go back and look at original sources and sort of tell the story properly. So that's when I start, is the 31st of August. And then as I go into the story, talking about, Poland's background and why Poland was essentially always going to fight in 1939. I do have a chapter, I think chapter 2, where I sort of take a step back and I go back into, show the long tail which leads us up to 1939. So not only into war politics, but also going way back in, like even into the 18th century, to explain Poland's rather sort of difficult, shall we say, brutal history, how it's been sort of imposed upon and invaded and occupied by its neighbours, and why it was always going to fight for its independence in 1939, whatever the odds were that were stacked against it. So I do range quite widely, certainly in teeing things up, but the main focus is quite tightly on this sort of 5-week period. Between the 1st of September, or the 31st of August anyway, up until the final, the surrender of the last Polish troops in the field, which is the 6th of October of 1939. So I do focus quite tightly on that.
Yeah, and that's one of the things I appreciate. It's not a massive period of time. You do have enough background, so if you're not familiar with the lead up to, those dates, that you'll still understand it. But it seems historians tend to have a issue with you get drawn into the past, and then before you know it, you're talking about medieval Germany, medieval Central Europe.
Yeah.
So it's kind of nice that it's contained in this way. And I think 1939 is obviously a fascinating year. One of the things you mentioned there was Poland was always going to fight. Now, I
Mm.
study pacifist Quakers who were never going to fight, and
Mm-hmm.
it's a really interesting difference there. What is the option there for the Poles?
It's a good question, because the example that is often juxtaposed next to Poland in 39 is that of the Czechoslovaks in 1938 with the Munich crisis. Of course, they weren't given the option to fight, because the British and the French basically said, if you cede the territory that Germany is demanding, then hopefully Germany will go away. The problem will go away. And Czechoslovakia is dismembered at the behest of the British and the French, and essentially peacefully. But then, obviously, 6 months later, it ceases to exist anyway. It's invaded by the Germans and wiped from the maps. But the Czechs had a sort of rather different attitude, and I suppose that it's all down to sort of their national histories and national cultures and so on. The Poles had a very rich history as an independent nation, as one of that, going back to the 17th century, it was the largest country in Europe, for example. So this, I think we're kind of conditioned almost to think of Poland as a sort of a new nation, because it re-emerges in 1918 at the end of the First World War. It hadn't existed. It had been wiped from the map by its neighbors. It had been partitioned by its neighbors in the late 18th century, and had not existed on the map of Europe for 123 years, from 1795 to 1918. And with the collapse of Russia, Germany, and Austria-Hungary almost simultaneously at the end of the First World War, then Poland can re-emerge, and that it does. But we're accustomed to kind of thinking of it in those terms as a new country, but it really wasn't. Its sort of folk memory and its political memory and national memory went way back, into the medieval period and beyond. And that was a period in which it had, it sort of bestrode Europe. It was the Poles that liberated Vienna from the Turks in 1683, for example. So, they had a rich military tradition, a rich military history, and they jealously wanted to defend their own independence. It had been hard won. After 123 years in the wilderness, their independence was hard won, and they were always going to defend it. So there are very peculiar kind of Polish elements of this story, which, as I'd suggest, I think means that Poland was always going to fight. Whatever the odds were against it, it was always going to want to defend itself. It would not go down the Czech route of kind of surrendering territory in the hope that the threats go away. It was always going to defend itself. So of course it went through the whole process of trying to find Western allies and people that would support it, so that it wouldn't have to fight, of course. But if it comes to it, it was always going to fight, and that's, I think, a sort of a different aspect to particularly the history of the Czechs in 38.
Right, and they're thrown into this situation. I mean, letters go back and forth leading up till September. There's a lot happening in world politics, but the news reports, like you mentioned right away from the start of your book, are put out by this German Nazi propaganda machine, and they feature very much in the historical literature, and you sort of weigh in on them in your book. What is their operation and their role in this conflict?
The Germans are basically trying to, and the ostensible reason is that they're looking to regain territory that Germany lost in 1918. Of course, as I've said, Germany collapses, monarchy collapses in 1918, and Poland sort of emerges from the ruins of that, and it takes territory from the collapsed German state, and most famously the Polish corridor, as it becomes known, up towards Danzig and the Baltic Sea. And this was territory that was sort of heavily populated by Germans as well. So even Danzig which is internationalized by the League of Nations after the First World War, that is also heavily populated by Germans to about sort of 95%. So these are, very often heavily German and historically German areas, but Poland is reconstituted as a multinational state. So there's always going to be some friction there, and there was friction there even before Hitler comes to power in 1933. But obviously Hitler has this tendency to, first of all, want to unite all Germans within the Reich, within a sort of a motherland. And secondarily, he also has this tendency to use ethnic German populations abroad as sort of political cat's paws to get what he wants, as he did very effectively in the Czechoslovak crisis of 1938. So there's a ramping up of certainly of the rhetoric and of the difficult situation that the two face, particularly from late 1938 onwards. And what the Germans try to do in the summer of 39, running up to the outbreak of war, is, as I said before, is effectively to sort of destabilize Poland, first of all, and secondarily to try and sort of cast it as the enemy. So there's this concerted campaign of, I suppose, border incursions, we could call them these days. They're sort of, again, false flag operations, lots of arson attacks on sort of isolated border farms and that sort of thing. Again, always trying to make it look as if the Poles are the aggressors, in which case, that you can basically cast them as the bad guys in the whole scenario, which actually they weren't. I mean, I've uncovered documents in the German archive which showed that this was a systematic campaign carried out by the SS to basically, try and show the Poles as the bad guys, which is quite remarkable. It's remarkable it hasn't really been written about before in this way. So it's quite a sort of the immediate run up to the war is actually quite fascinating, and how the German state operated in that way to try. This wasn't playing as an honest broker at all. Not that we'd expect that from Hitler, of course, but really it was quite astonishing how devious they were.
And do you think this is an effect of the history being written by the victors? Because the Germans do eventually win with this invasion, and even they have the propaganda machine to put forth this news to the world.
Yeah, and this is part of the problem. And what's interesting, I suppose, is that in the micro aspect of this, like if you look at the Gleiwitz incident itself, it doesn't really have the propaganda effect that it is supposed to. So it doesn't isolate Poland from its allies. It doesn't cast Poland as the bad guy in terms of international opinion. But in the much broader sense, in the sort of macro, it's Poland doesn't ever get to tell its story effectively. So because Poland is destroyed in 39, its armed forces either go into the Polish underground, or they're sort of cast to the four winds and end up in various allied armies, or else, of course, deported to wilder reaches of the Soviet Union, which is another fate that was reserved for them. So there's no one effectively to tell Poland's story after 39. So in the immediate sort of wartime period, the Germans write about the Polish campaign, obviously in a sort of heavily propagandistic manner. Poland's inferior military was seen as a very useful kind of adjunct to Poland's racial inferiority, as they wanted to describe it. So, they didn't hold back in telling the story of the Polish campaign, but in a very propagandistic manner. So it certainly wasn't a true telling of the campaign at all. And beyond that, no one else had a dog in the fight. No one else wanted to tell the story. Bush and the French didn't. The Soviets were intent on insisting to the world that they hadn't been involved in Poland in 39, hadn't invaded in 39. So they didn't tell the story. And to a large extent, the same prevails even after 1945. Those that are writing the history and the recent history, as it was, have got bigger fish to fry. So the Germans are writing, talking about the Nazi regime, or they're talking about the Holocaust, from the 1960s onwards. German historians are writing about other things, are writing about bigger crimes, effectively, carried out by the Germans. And every other nation is telling its own story, and effectively no one's telling the Polish story. So it kind of got forgotten. And it's really until 89, the political changes of 89, when a lot of these sources that I use particularly are actually available to be examined. So it's high time it was told, effectively.
Yeah. And in there, you mentioned the Polish forces and the ease that the Germans had of comparing that to a backwardness of Polish society. Uh,
Yeah.
but it didn't even seem to match up with the evidence. One of this memorable images that teachers and professors often use, especially with World War I, is the image of cavalry charging against guns. And
Mm.
here we find that,
Against tanks. Yeah.
yeah, the trope repeating itself. This time it's against tanks. It's almost like a total analogy to a lot of the way World War I is talked about. Here, the Poles
Yeah.
are doing, again, the same World War I mistake. But you have some interesting information about those cavalry charges in there.
Yeah, I mean, this is the thing. As I said, the story didn't get told. Certainly not objectively, not truthfully, for far too long. And in the absence of the true story, you're left effectively with the wartime propaganda. And the great trope, as you put it, of German wartime propaganda, certainly as regards Poland, is this narrative of cavalry charging against tanks, which is extremely durable, has proved extremely durable, and it still goes around these days. The number of times I've been asked about it when I've been promoting this book, it's been astonishing. So it's something that I really wanted to get to grips with and actually get to the bottom of where the story came from. I mean, it's just before I sort of tell that story, it's worth mentioning that I think the image that the Germans wanted to project to the world is of themselves as this sort of hyper-modern, mechanized, armored force going into Poland, which was backward, which was racially dubious, and was, fighting with, the same sort of methods and the same tactics that would have been seen at the Battle of Waterloo 100 years plus before. So Poland is not only, technologically damned; it's racially damned in consequence as well. So it's very easy for them to see, a correlation between this general backwardness, this tactical backwardness, and Poland's, lack of racial worth, should we put it? So this is the way the Nazis are viewing the world. But in truth, in 1939, I mean, obviously the Germans have many more tanks than the Poles, but the Poles have tanks, absolutely. And toe-to-toe with German tanks at the time, they would stand their ground. They were pretty good. And crucially, all combatant armies in 1939 still had cavalry. So this idea that the Germans wanted to project of, the German force all in tanks, all in this sort of, the hardened Krupp steel advancing forward versus these primitive antediluvian Poles on horseback is actually nonsensical. That's not how it was. The Germans go into those battles with more cavalry than the Poles had. So that's sort of point one. This is a sort of rather mythological presumption that they're all in tanks and the Poles are not. But actually, the Polish cavalry, which is the cream of the Polish army at the time, fights very well. They fight dismounted for a start, so they don't do cavalry charges against tanks. That would be ludicrous, and it was just as ludicrous to them as it would seem to us today. They fought dismounted. They had anti-tank rifles, which were very effective. They towed little artillery pieces with them, which were also very effective. And they were very good at meeting the German threat and in many cases defeating them. So they could certainly hold up the German advance for a day or two, and there's various examples of that happening. So the Polish cavalry is really not the sort of thing of ridicule that the Germans wanted us to believe it was. It was actually quite an effective fighting force. But to get back to that myth. The idea that was propagated by German propaganda, it actually comes from. I sort of kind of wanted to find the sort of mother lode of where this story came from, and it came quite strangely. It came from an Italian war journalist. His name was Indro Montanelli, and he was embedded, effectively, to use a modern term, he was embedded with German forces. Of course, Italy was not necessarily allied with the Germans, but was a fellow fascist state, so they sent their journalists along to record this victory of fascist armor. And he was with German troops, and he saw the aftermath of one of these engagements, the battlefield on the Bzura, which was one of the biggest engagements of the September campaign. And he saw this battlefield in the aftermath with sort of strewn with the bodies of Polish cavalrymen and of their horses. And he wrote this piece, which was then published in the Corriere della Sera that he wrote for, which was headed "Cavalry Against Tanks." That's where the line came from. And it was reasonably sympathetic, curiously. It was quite sympathetic to the Poles. He was basically saying these poor guys are, they're trying very hard, but they can't make much headway. And this was how it was reported. And then, of course, that was picked up by the German propaganda ministry, Goebbels' propaganda ministry in Berlin. And that became, if you like, the sort of verifiable source that they could point to and say, look, this is where, these are independent journalists who are writing this stuff. This isn't us. So that became their unimpeachable source. And they started talking about cavalry against tanks. And again, the implicit message of that was that inferiority technologically also applied to race, that the Poles were racially inferior as well. So, and that was the origin of it, and that's where they sort of ran with this idea. So it's a very curious story, and it's one that hopefully now, hopefully if enough people read the book, then hopefully we can kind of change the history a little bit, and that particular trope can stop being mentioned in history lectures and history classes at schools and so on, because it's really past its sell-by date.
Yeah, and it really does a disservice to the skill of these militaries. These are people with brains who have fought, they're battle hardened, they study war. They're not gonna, they don't just stand up and kill them.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
No,
So,
absolutely. I mean, it's a rather ridiculous proposition, and I have a few accounts where Polish cavalry do carry out cavalry charges. As I said, it wasn't their usual modus operandi, but they were still trained to do it in the right circumstances. I mean, cavalry against infantry in 1939 could be just as devastating as it was in 1815, right? So there's a couple of instances where Polish cavalry charged German infantry with tremendous effect. That could still be terrifying. So it's a much more. It's like all these things, Steve. It's always history is a much more nuanced and complex subject than we kind of imagine it is. We have this rather simplified version that is often taught in schools and taught in universities, and it's boiled down until sometimes it becomes a sort of a pastiche of the real thing. And we have to just remember, this is a reminder that we have to remember that history is complex, and we have to embrace that complexity.
And you do see it's also it's hard work, and it's not, if you're coming to the easy answer from just having one source, then that might not be the right answer.
Absolutely.
Yeah, so that's great. And you mentioned just with cavalry as an example, but among our conversation so far, that the Nazis did not just roll over and sweep straight to Warsaw and have a victory. I mean, this takes weeks, and there is a level of barbarism, and you mentioned the racial prejudice. There's that quote in the Armenian Genocide Museum of Hitler, that talking to his soldiers before the Polish invasion, who after all remembers the annihilation of the Armenians. And so this is a brutal battle, and involving civilians. Maybe you can take us through that a little bit, what happens after these operations.
I mean, we should add, I mean, the Poles fight well, as I've described, but they are massively outnumbered. They are outnumbered in terms of tanks, in terms of technology, and so they are very much up against it. And they're also, effectively being invaded on three sides. So Germany is both, to the Poland southwest, to its west, to its northwest, and to the north and East Prussia. So it's like in the jaws of an enormous German pincer in 1939. If anyone out there can remember the map of Germany and Poland in 1939, they're very different shape from what they are now. So you just have to remember that Poland really is up against it. And as I say, it fights well as could be expected, but it is, defeated fairly swiftly. So, the German spearhead reaches Warsaw, I think, on about the 8th of September, so after just over a week. But then, of course, Warsaw doesn't fall until the 28th. Of September. So there's a long siege of Warsaw, and there's much more that goes on in the interim, and some very significant military campaigns in that time as well. So the Poles really do give a much better account of themselves than we traditionally understand. But yeah, we have to remember as well, and this is the point that you alluded to in your question, Germany is going into Poland effectively to wage a race war. This is my sort of contention. This I don't know if it sounds surprising or not, but given that the Polish campaign generally gets glossed over and doesn't get talked about, perhaps this might surprise a few people. We're accustomed to talking about the German invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941 as being an onset of race war. With the sort of ramping up of targeting of civilians, the targeting of Jews, the wanton killing of civilians and POWs, and all of that the Germans are doing from 1941 onwards. But my contention is they're doing that in 1939 as well, and for the same reason, because they're motivated by racial prejudice. So this is a race war, and you can see there's countless evidence of this, and there's a very telling comparison to be made between the Polish campaign and the campaign in France in 1940, which is only about 7 months later. In Poland in 1939, almost every other village or every other town is basically torched. Civilian populations will have seen a massacre or two. It was routine to line up POWs or to line up civilians and shoot a handful of them for any perceived misdemeanor. It didn't matter what it was. They could have found a penknife in somebody's pocket, literally. They could have found a razor in somebody's pocket. I mean, very often farmers, for example, are targeted because if you search a farmhouse, you can probably find a pitchfork and a shotgun, right? Yeah. These are interpreted as weapons. Therefore, these people are bandits. This is the Nazi mentality. Therefore, they're going to be put up against the wall and shot. Right? This was routine. This is how it worked. So, through that 5-week period of the Polish campaign, 1st of September to the 6th of October, there are something like over 600 massacres and atrocities carried out against civilians and POWs. Over 600. And those are the ones that are documented, right? So those are the ones that we can kind of nail down. And if you contrast that to the French campaign, which is a similar length, it's 6 weeks as opposed to 5. It's only about 6 months later. So the broad conditions of warfare and so on are similar. In the French campaign, there are something like 20 massacres only. Now that's bad enough, right?
Yeah.
But you can see from that comparison, 20 in the French campaign versus over 600 in the Polish campaign, that there's something fundamental going on. And there's something fundamental and fundamentally different in the way that German troops perceive their enemy. And my argument is that they perceive the British and the French as being fellow civilized human beings who are worthy of their respect. And they do not view the Poles in the same way. They see the Poles as being fundamentally expendable. So this is my argument that they're actually going into Poland effectively to wage race war in 1939.
And it's interesting now, perhaps we can shift as well to the other side. It's interesting that it seems there's somewhat of a similar justification at times coming from the Soviet Union in regards to Belarusians and Ukrainians saying, well, we're liberating these minorities from a brutal regime. Maybe we can talk a little bit about the Soviet invasion and how that we haven't seen the evidence maybe that we have from the Nazis in the same number, but we know what happens.
Yeah, it's this is an interesting part of the story because it doesn't get talked about enough. The Soviet invasion of Poland in 1939. It's something that Mr. Putin and his friends to this day still try and dispute because it's really doesn't fit their narrative. Bear in mind the overarching aspect here, of course, is that the Soviet narrative of World War II tells the world that the Soviet Union was attacked by the Germans in 1941, June 41, Operation Barbarossa, and that's when their war began, right? And so they are forever either only the victims or the victors of World War II. They're never the perpetrators. They're never the aggressors. They're always just the victims or the victors. But actually, if we're honest about this, and again, this is, if Mr. Putin's listening, he needs to be honest about this as well. The Soviet Union's war Second World War begins on the 17th of September. You could even say the 23rd of August, when it signs the Nazi-Soviet Pact with Hitler. The Soviet Union is just as inimical, just as hostile towards the existence of Poland as the Germans are. So there's a natural sort of coincidence of strategic ideas between them and the Germans in 39. And they divide up Germany between them. There's a very nice map. One of my previous books had a lovely map that was produced by the two, with a nice big thick line through the middle of Poland. And they're basically saying, you have this bit, we'll have that bit, and we'll meet in the middle. And that's what they did. So the Soviets invade Poland on the 17th of September. And they carry out, as I said, if the Germans are carrying out race war in the West, the Soviets come in to carry out class war in the East. So they target, merchants, the wealthy, priests, anyone of any standing in society, professors, lawyers, doctors, and actually particularly Poles. So there's even a sort of racial component to what they're doing. The official narrative that they give the world in 39 is that they are carrying out a humanitarian operation. Where have we heard that before? That sounds very much like Mr. Putin going into Ukraine in 2014. So that again, it's a very similar operation. It's lots of smoke and mirrors and lots of propaganda narrative for the outside world. So that they go in to supposedly liberate those populations of Ukrainians and Belarusians who had found themselves subjects of the Polish state for the intervening 20 years, and not particularly happy subjects of the Polish state, one must add. The Polish state was quite nationalistic, the Second Republic, so it was quite prejudicial towards those populations. So in many cases, they did welcome the arrival of the Red Army. They would, in most cases, they would rue that welcome because they soon realized that they're incorporated into the Soviet Union with all that entailed. But they're going in with this sort of mythological narrative of liberation, and really, it's a sort of a Marxist imperialist operation to re-annex that lost territory. And as I said, it's a class war as well. So they're trying to eliminate. You don't build communism if you leave in place all of those people who have any sort of significance and standing in society. So they very systematically remove all of those people with status. So those with education, with political positions, with positions within the state, local administrations, lawyers, and so on. All of those people are forcibly removed, many of them deported to the wilder reaches of Siberia. Again, this is a story that we don't hear because, again, the Soviet narrative effectively managed to cover it up. They managed to keep it quiet, keep it out of the sort of standard Western canon of the story of World War II. But upwards of 1 million Poles are deported to Siberia in the 2 years before 1941, and they're deported because they don't fit. They don't fit in the new communist state. You basically want peasants and workers, and you don't want anybody else because those other people rock the boat. They're too clever. They know too much. So you have to get rid of them, and that's how the Soviets did it. So they're coming in with a class agenda. So you are, Poland is royally doomed in 1939. Race war to the west, class war to the east.
And so when they used, you look left and right for help, and if it's not there, you look up and pray. But elsewhere in the world, I mean, there were journalists, like you said, there were Italian journalists, there were journalists from the United States, from Britain, who are covering this, and the Germans are covering it, the Soviets are covering it. In my own research, I go through these Cuban newspapers around the same time period, where there's a tremendous sense of defeat. I mean, of defeat in the Soviets having made friends with the fascists, and just this breakdown of this socialist promise and what communism could have meant, because I mean, this is talking when Cuba and Batista are more communist than capitalist. So what about, and Cuba's rather insignificant in the conversation, but how about the UK and France? What are they doing while Poland's here praying for help?
Well, that's a very good question, and really they should have been doing a lot more than they were, because as I think I mentioned, France and Britain are Poland's allies in 1939. They had both promised to come to Poland's aid in the event of aggression against Poland. That, of course, happens on the 1st of September. They then, both London and Paris, declare war on the Germans on the 3rd of September. So they kind of do all the right things, but they actually do not follow up with any action whatsoever. So it's very curious how the sort of the mood music and the messaging coming out of London and Paris is all of talking about exhorting Poland to sort of continued acts of resistance and setting a sort of standard and a moral standard in standing up to tyranny and all of this stuff. And this is the sort of messaging, and yet they're doing nothing. So the British and the French basically have a number of high-level meetings. They kind of avoid the Polish attachés, by the way, because they have nothing good to say to the Polish attachés, who are desperate for information and desperate to know when the grand offensive in the West is going to kick in. They avoid those people because they don't want to have those conversations. But they have high-level conversations, summits amongst themselves, where they basically write the Poles off and they say, well, there's nothing we can do to save them. And to some extent they were right, because the sort of lazy assumption I think often is that people think the British and the French could have projected their power to the Eastern European theatre, to Poland itself, but they couldn't. The range of British and French aircraft was not sufficient to do that. But they could have been more robust in taking the war to Germany in the West. The French on the ground, the British in the air. And there's no real logistical obstacle to that happening. So this isn't because, you could say, well, the British didn't have troops on the ground in France. No, they didn't. They were in the process of doing that. But the French were on the ground. The French could have invaded. And they did try this. There was this operation against Western Germany, the so-called Saar offensive, which lasted for about 5 days. They advanced about 5 kilometers. One fired a rifle at them and they retreated. I mean, I'm sort of portraying it in rather ridiculous terms, Stephen, but it was ridiculous. It redefined half-hearted. So the French try this attack on the ground, which doesn't do anything. They're really extremely half-hearted. And the British tried. They bomb German naval installations from the air. They even dropped leaflets over Western Germany, places like Cologne and Dusseldorf. So they're able to go and drop leaflets, but they don't have the political will to actually drop bombs. That's the difference. So there's no political will in London and Paris to actually go to war in Poland's name. So they're sort of fighting just with consonants and vowels rather than with bombs and bullets. And I still, even having researched it and written the book and all the rest of it, I still find that shameful. We have to understand where it comes from. That this was two governments and societies that are still pretty much fixed in the mood and the mindset of appeasement of 1938. They're shifting slowly, but they're still fundamentally in that same mindset, and they're kind of also wanting to preserve their own forces for what they see as an inevitable attack that's coming. So they don't want to sort of squander their own resources, military power, in what they perceive as a lost cause. So there's a lot more going on, but I still think that's a rather shameful episode. So really, not much is done, and there's a lot of hand-wringing in London and Paris, a lot of rather sort of pointless words of encouragement addressed towards the Poles, but very, very little in the way of actual action. That's something that didn't escape the Poles either. One of the tragedies of this, and one of the most tragic episodes of this, is how the Western offensives and the Western operations against the Germans, I mean, hugely limited though they were reported in the Polish press, because the Polish press, it's almost an exercise in kind of, writing up a wish list, because they sort of say, oh, Stuttgart has just fallen to the French, and the British are bombing Hamburg, and they're just kind of almost making it up because this is what they want to happen, but it isn't actually happening. So it's tragic to look at that again from the Polish perspective.
And that's a sort of timeless thing that we face in history and in the present is this question of, when do you act? And it's a question that I've certainly challenged peers and students with. Would you
Yeah,
go fight in Poland if it came to that? Would you go fight in China? Would you go fight anywhere?
yeah.
The war is changing now, and obviously, but it seems to be something we're always faced with now. We could get very deep into that, and there's a
Yeah.
lot to it. But one thing I do want to ask you about, that we've kind of skirted around, interestingly enough, is you are able to bring some Polish accounts into this, and the temptation is so much to talk about the Nazis and the Soviets and the
Mm.
British. Maybe what is a story that you uncovered from the Polish point of view that really stuck with you, that you think is a really important takeaway?
Oh, God, there are so many. I mean, I really very deliberately wanted to almost sort of tell the story from a Polish perspective. Um, where, as I've said at the beginning, this is a period, this is an episode that really hasn't been written about enough, and where it's been written about really at all, um, it has used a lot of sort of German sources, so memoirs of people like General Guderian, for example, who wrote a very interesting memoir which covers this period. So they tend to use German sources and have German voices, and the result is you effectively see it through a German prism, right?
Hmm.
The Soviets obviously are absent. They're not part of the conventional narrative on this because they've chosen to absent themselves. But a lot of what I wanted to do, above and beyond what I mentioned just now about giving it sort of a true account of events and to bring the Soviets into the narrative, but I wanted to render the Polish experience not just as sort of nameless, faceless victims, but actually as real voices, and give them their sort of status back, their
Hmm.
humanity back. So it really had a sort of trawl of the archives to do that, and we found some absolutely fantastic accounts. There's a housewife in Warsaw who goes through all the sort of a whole gamut of emotions, from the almost elation of the 3rd of September when the British and the French declare war, and she says, right, we're saved. We
Hmm.
can't possibly lose if the British and the French are on our side. And all the way through to the final, surrender of Warsaw on the 28th of September, at which point, she's completely crestfallen and in despair. So hers was a fantastic diary, which I make some quite extensive use of. But there are so many voices there, and they really, I mean, for me, I thought that was one of the most illuminating parts, to actually try and see it from a Polish perspective, because it's not just what we think would be, this attitude of I suppose stoically, fighting against foreign aggression. There's a whole complex of emotions. There's a lot of anger towards the West when they realise that they are being betrayed, that the West are not, coming riding over the horizon to their aid. There's a lot of anger, and that comes across very strongly as well. So, I think what I wanted to do was to put the Poles back into the narrative, put them back on the map, and I hope I've done that.
Hmm.
I hope I've done that effectively. So yeah, that was a sort of crucial part of what I wanted to do.
Yeah, and it is heart-wrenching reading those accounts, especially when we're searching for hopeful news these days, and you see that people, when you get just one slice of hope, it seems like everything's going to be resolved, and
Yeah,
to know as you're reading it, this is only 1939.
yeah,
um, Warsaw is kind of important city in Poland. It doesn't fall easily to the Germans, and the resistance continues on. But Hitler wants his press moment, doesn't he? Uh,
yeah.
you have some fascinating photos, and I thought it was just really interesting that you can never really see Warsaw in the background
Mm,
because it's almost totally gone. Um,
yeah.
can you talk about the result? I guess you don't want to give away too much, but where do we end up with this?
We end up with Poland being overrun from
Hmm.
two sides. Soviets from the east, the Germans in the west. They effectively as I said, draw a line in the middle and divide it up. Warsaw Falls is besieged for the best part of 2 weeks. There is a sort of a lull in proceedings during this Bzura campaign. is then sort of besieged for about 2 weeks, and it's a very brutal siege. Again, it's one that doesn't tend to generally bother the history books. We might, history generally will talk about the bombing of, I don't know, Coventry or Rotterdam, or later on the bombing of Dresden, but the siege of Warsaw in 1939 should really be up there in the same category, because it is a siege, and it's a deliberate targeting of the civilian population as well. So they're not just fighting the soldiers in front of them in the suburbs, they're actually sending us artillery shells and aircraft to bomb the civilian areas. So this is a deliberate attempt to undermine Polish morale. This is the new warfare, incidentally. This is one of the things I think is quite interesting about the Polish campaign, which makes it all the more fascinating that it's been ignored, because you've got all the same traits that are sort of written so large in the later history of World War II. The sort of deliberate targeting of civilians, the indiscriminate aerial bombing, ideological warfare, the use of blitzkrieg, all of that. All of those traits are there in 1939. It's not as though they kind of develop later in the war, reaching a crescendo in, after 41, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It's all there in 1939, which makes it all the more remarkable that this hasn't been, properly treated before. By the time Warsaw falls, Warsaw is really a sort of moonscape, because it's been absolutely battered and besieged for most of the previous month. There are some remarkable accounts of people. There's one always sticks in my mind. You mentioned earlier on what account sticks in my mind. There's one account from I think it's from a military barracks, and one of the officers comes down the stairs, and he's announcing that he's heard about this capitulation. Warsaw has capitulated, and he said, we've surrendered, and he stands there for a moment, and he pulls out his pistol and shoots himself. Because that's, the sort of shame of surrender was something that he couldn't tolerate. And there are lots of accounts like that, which I found very, very moving. And the people who left, there's this sort of exodus from southeastern Poland. The only sort of way out that they had, and it was only a sort of temporary exit, was out through Romania. So, the government and a lot of the senior personnel and general staff and so on tried to escape down through Romania. And there are a lot of people who cross the river Prut it is, that down into Romania. And as they cross over, some of them look back to Poland and they say, well, that's it. I've left. My family is still there, and I'll never see this country again. And it's one of those moments in history where you can almost feel how history has changed. The world has changed, and these people will not be the same again. It's quite remarkable. So there were some fantastic accounts that I found. I hope that I've really managed to put the Polish experience back on the map.
Yeah, that's great. And one of the things that you've had success with in the past is you write these books that have great reach, and they're also received academically as well. Maybe you could talk a little bit about striking that balance of reaching out to people to make history accessible while at the same time challenging some of these areas that need more focus.
Yeah, I mean, it is two aspects that I tend to try and concentrate on, because I don't like the idea of doing historical subjects that are kind of well covered and everyone's done it and we all know about it. So if you ever catch me doing a book about D-Day or the Dunkirk or the Dam Busters, please take me out and shoot me, because I just don't want to do it, because it's so well covered. There's really not much you can bring to the party. And I want, for my own benefit, I've got to write these books. They take about 2 years to write. I've got to get up every morning. I've got to be stimulated, and for me to do that, I want to be doing something that's a bit novel and a bit challenging, and that people might not necessarily know too much about. So that's part of what I want to do. But then, of course, in terms of marketing and in terms of reaching an audience, there's a good proportion of the popular history audience that, will devour any book that comes out on D-Day, because they go, well, I read all the other stuff about D-Day, so I may as well read this one.
Right.
And whether it's new material or not, they don't really care. They'll just read it, right? So in a sense, you have to work a bit harder to actually make this stuff, palatable, interesting, accessible. to the ordinary reader, to actually drag them in. And that means actually, putting effort into your writing, putting effort into how you present the history. You can't afford to just do it in a sort of, one damn thing after the next kind of approach. It actually has to have an element of sort of almost cinematic thought, I suppose, as to how you present these things, and yet within the constraints of the material that you've got, right? So this is why I find it quite fascinating to do these sort of set pieces. Like I talked at the beginning, we talked about the opening section, which is on the Gleiwitz incident of 31st of August. I collected up all of the materials, and then whilst being true to those materials, I mean, obviously you can't make stuff up, right? Because that's not history anymore.
Right.
So being true to those materials, you have to then tell the story in as accessible and as dramatic a way as possible. And I enjoy sort of working within those constraints. I find that quite sort of stimulating. So, I enjoyed writing this one, actually. I had a lot of material to play with. And it was really interesting stuff. It's very new, as I said, so that it ticked that box. And those are my sort of twin guiding stars, really. It's a novelty, and also trying to present it in as accessible a way as possible.
It's funny that you mentioned that there at the end, because whether it's a blog post or a manuscript, or a tweet, even, you can tell when someone enjoyed writing something or when they were forced to do it. It's
true.
Very interesting balance.
And I think it's one of the sort of tragedies, in a way, that so much academic history, there is this sort of divide between academic and popular history, and I think it's rather artificial divide. It's rather unnecessary. But there's a tragedy, really, that most academics generally don't write well. So they although they have all the material, they have all the knowledge, it's difficult for them to meet the ordinary reading public and make their work accessible. And then on the other side, a lot of popular history tends to be quite regurgitative. So it just writes about the same old stuff in the same old way, and maybe with a little bit of a journalistic tweak here, or a bit, so the semblance of new material there. And both sides of that sort of spectrum, I think, are, I find it, I don't sympathize with. I want a new material, and I want to have it expressed in an accessible way. So those are the two sort of guiding principles that I'm trying to meet.
That's great. And well, we certainly have links to everything on ourhistory.com. Roger Poland 1939 is out soon. It'll be out by the time this podcast is released, and I see the reviews are already flowing in, and people are pleased with the book. So I'm glad you did it. I'm glad you wrote it, and I'm glad you're on the show. We've reached the part of the show, though, where we get to do a suggestion and tell the world what we think they should be doing.
My suggestion here, again, is sort of staying with the Polish theme. It ties in with this book sort of tangentially, but also with my previous book, The Devil's Alliance. So my sort of suggestion for the listeners is to go and find, rent, download, however it works these days, Andrzej Wajda's film Katyn, which came out, I think, about 10 years ago, maybe 2008, I think it was, which is an account of the Katyn massacres, which is something that many of us that perhaps don't have any Polish connections will perhaps only dimly have heard of. But it's one of those sort of seminal moments in Poland's wartime history. This was when, across 3 sites in Western Soviet Union, 22,000 Polish officers of various types, military officers, prison officers, policemen, and so on, were taken out and systematically executed by the Soviet security forces, the NKVD, and then buried in mass graves. And these are the same people who are routinely being asked about, where did these officers disappear to? By the time that the Soviet Union was invaded in turn in the summer of 1941, and the Soviet Union then became an ally of the West. Bear in mind, of course, the Soviet Union is on the wrong side for the first 2 years of the war. But when it became an ally of the West, and you have these meetings between Roosevelt and Churchill and Stalin, and it was quite often asked, what happened to those Polish officers? And Stalin would say, well, I think they all escaped. They all went to Manchuria. And he knew very well that they'd been executed in the spring of 1940. He actually signed the order that by which they were to be executed. So it shows, I think, in absolute clarity, the event, that is, it shows in absolute clarity the sort of brutal, murderous nature of the Soviet Union as a state in this time under Stalin.
Wow.
And at the same time, it shows us how difficult Poland's fate was in World War II. So again, not only the aggressor from the West, the race-obsessed aggressor, the genocidal Holocaust carrying out aggressor of Nazi Germany, but also the Stalinist horrors of the Soviet Union. So I think it shows that, the film shows that in vivid, brutal detail, and it's absolutely heart-wrenching.
Yeah.
So that would be, gird yourself, make sure you've got a glass of wine.
Yeah.
But that would be my suggestion, to go and watch Andrzej Wajda's film Katyn.
That's great. And we'll have a link to that. My suggestion might be something that you do after or before to get your spirits back up and to feel hope again in the world. It's a set. We know Frederic Chopin as one of Poland's great composers, and mostly for his excellent piano work. But he also wrote 19 songs for voice and piano. And there's Polish language songs, and some of these he wrote as young as age 17, so while he was still in Warsaw. And I am a huge fan of Chopin. I think everyone should listen to his piano work too, but while we're in the Polish mood, listen to his Polish songs. There's some recordings, and like you said, it's on Spotify and Amazon and all those places where you can find them, and maybe that'll help you process some of the book and some of the movie.
An antidote to the horror.
An antidote to the horror, which we all need so desperately. So thank you so much, Roger Moorhouse. The book is Poland 1939, and there's a lot more information at hourofhistory.com. Thanks for joining me, Roger.
My pleasure. Thank you.
All right. Thanks for listening, everyone. On Hour of History, it's our world, anytime, any place. So long.